it was Simon Baron-Cohen, who's one of the leading researchers right in this area, who said, taking a person on the spectrum and putting them in prison is like taking someone who is wheelchair bound, throwing them into the deep end of a pool and expecting them to cope.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. About 1 in 44 are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Many more have it and don't even have a diagnosis. That means every lawyer has represented untold number of clients who were on the spectrum, but most of us don't understand what autism is and why it matters. Therefore, helping us get set for sentencing today are attorney extraordinaire, I would say, Toni Sparks, and Dr. Toni Sparks, psychologist. She's a professor of practice, associate professor, that's a mouthful, Toni, associate professor of practice, disability, and psychoeducational studies at the University of Arizona. By the way, I did a little Googling, which is always a dangerous thing. Did you know, Toni, that you are ranked on one class as one of the top 10 professors at the University of Arizona? Yeah. That's who's in the house today helping us get set for sentencing. Toni Sparks is a former prosecutor. I'm not going to hold it against her. An amazing criminal defense lawyer. In that arena, she does capital work, death penalty work, which is about as real and hard and gratifying and sad and horrifying as it comes in our business of the legal profession, I think is fair to say. She also has a thriving civil practice and a billboard. She loves wild horses and tumbling dice. She'll drink all the liquor and leave you the ice. That's from Brandy. I always think you when I hear that lyric. Anyway, we are going to be talking about autism spectrum disorder today, and there's no two better people to kick off this conversation, and we're going to do it in the context of a real live case study, so we can make these concepts super real. So I just want to first say thank you both so much for being here on Set for Sentencing. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely. So let's just start digging, and I'm going to throw it to Toni Sparks to give us kind of the fact scenario of the case that we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, sure. So after that introduction, it's all downhill from there. We're not going to live up to that, but I had a case, I was referred a case where two parents called me frantically that the police department were in their house and had just left and arrested their son. And they were informed at that time that he had child pornography on his computer, and he was eventually charged with the typical kind of 10 counts of merely possessing child pornography and it being on his computer. Just because I know this goes to people everywhere or whoever your audience is, I think it's an important distinction to know that it is merely a possession on his computer, that there's nothing more than that. Because I think sometimes people get confused as to, you know, when you don't realize when you're in this business, but when you're explaining this to someone and they'll say, well, was he taking pictures of the little kids? And you're like, well, no, he wasn't taking pictures of them. So just to be clear, literally just having the picture on the computer. So he was charged with 10 images.
Yeah. And of course, that's still a major, major crime. There's variations of it, which is possessing it and then sending it around, distributing it. And then the worst, obviously, is making it. But your guy just has it on his computer. So what kind of trouble is he in? What's he facing in the worst case scenario?
So the detectives actually told the parents, imagine this, parents who have had just turned 19 when he was arrested. But so these parents of these 19-year-old kid are told, to answer your question, that they basically tell the parents, by the way, if he's convicted, this is a lifetime conviction. So it's 10 years a picture, but that has to be served consecutive to one another. So if you're found guilty of 3 pictures, that's 30 years. So what they typically do is charge about 10 pictures because it's 100 years, clearly a life sentence if you go to trial and you lose.
And by the way, this came up in the recent confirmation hearings about how easy, Judge Jackson was talking about how easy it is in this day and age to download thousands of images at the click of one button. So you're saying even just one, he probably he could have had hundreds of images on there.
And they almost always do. They almost always, as you know, Doug, they almost always do have much more than the 10. It's usually, as you say, you're downloading a folder. One folder will get you a lifetime, and then some.
Yeah. Okay. Now there will be people listening to this who are automatically repulsed by the very thought of what your client has on his computer. And like Lindsey Graham at the hearing says, good, if somebody's looking at this stuff, first of all, they're pedophiles or they're pedophiles in waiting. And why not? Good. Well, let's lock him up. He actually said 30, 40, or 50 years is great with him. So why not? What's wrong?
Well, I think that's where, aside from us talking about autism spectrum disorder today, aside from that, it's a wonderful way to highlight, I suppose, why you shouldn't just be morally and why your reaction shouldn't just be lock them up and throw away the key. I think it comes down to this, I think in every realm, is lack of information, not being educated on subjects. And the reason I say that in this realm is because you eventually do something called a psychosexual examination. That's what you do as a defense attorney. I think talking about the psychosexual examination might help answer this question, Doug, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You have a professional who is trained in this. Basically, not only do they do a full-blown examination, but they do a polygraph. So they basically test their work, right? So they say, hey, is this person deviant? It's everything you just said. Is this person somebody who is gratified by looking at little children? And so when you submit your client to that, it's obviously a little scary because these tests can be, it's a whole other subject about whether or not you think they're valid. But if anything, we had this young man submit to a psychosexual examination to answer that question exactly, which is this person really being gratified by what they're seeing as far as these images? And oftentimes the answer is no, they're not. There are very different reasons that it even ends up on someone's computer. But some of this actually goes hand in hand, I think, with the diagnosis, which I know.
Yeah. So let's talk. Okay. So perfect segue. Thank you so much. So the question is, okay, if they've done a psychosexual evaluation, they say they don't have sexual attraction to children, this deviant, pedophilic, whatever, then the question is, okay, what's going on in this case? Now, you all, in terms of the million listeners that are tuned in, that will be tuned into this, you might have noticed that these two people have the same last name. So so Jamie has a pretty amazing resource on speed dial, which is her sister, who is a subject matter expert in this area. But we also share this in common. We have another benefit to our life and our practice, in that we have people we love dearly in our life who are on the autism spectrum, and it's our kids. And so I think that probably made you maybe a little predisposed to recognizing the issue, and thank goodness you had Dr. Sparks as a resource. So let me bring you into this conversation and tell me, okay, something else is going on with this guy. What is it, and where do we go from here?
And I'll tell you this so Toni can take it from here. You're exactly right, Doug. And that's I think why I was so excited and glad that you asked us to do this is I was frightened to think about if this young man had gone to a different attorney for no other reason than I got to watch my nephew and then my niece, but specifically my nephew. If I had not seen that since the time he was a baby and be very active in his life and have my sister, I don't know what would happen to this kid because of the recognition. And I want Toni to jump in and then I can tell you what I recognize, but I think I can inform people what you can look for, even if you didn't have a nephew, even if it wasn't near and dear to your heart. I think there are things we should know as practitioners that signal something here is different, and you should have the due diligence to follow that up. But yes, my nephew is a beautiful reason that this young man, I think, had his life saved as well. But go ahead, Toni.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, so that's a really nice way to kind of, tie the thread between why it is that we're all here. And so I feel really fortunate having been able to be a part of the process, in the sense that not only is it really fulfilling professionally to be able to help someone who's on the spectrum, but when you think that personally, these are the folks that you live with, you love, that you want to make sure that you're making, designing a better community for them out there that they're going to come into contact with, and that, God forbid they ever make a mistake, that someone else recognizes, shows grace, shows some kind of mercy in those situations. But I think, again, to kind of go back to what you talked about, which is trying to separate sort of the unpleasantness of the crime, and try to understand how somebody, on the spectrum, like how can we sort of come to a rationale as to why this would be occurring. I think the really important thing is that you have a lot of folks on the spectrum where the internet is really a trap. It becomes a place for a lot of people on the spectrum where they build community. So whether it's, accessing child pornography, or whether it's someone who is a young adult individual who doesn't have a lot of social connection, doesn't have a lot of friends, going into gaming circles, right? And finding yourself, losing yourself in a fantasy world where you're comfortable because people don't really know you and you kind of have a unknown identity. That's a real issue that we're seeing for young people who are on the spectrum, who, because we know that they really struggle with social skills development, this is a place that they can go get lost. And so, this would be my plug to tell parents, really look at what your kids are up to on the internet. Just as an example, and this case really helped me to have a really important conversation with my two teenagers, which is my son, Dylan, is my world historian, right? He loves everything about politics, geopolitics, military history. And, in the last year, he's become really fascinated with nuclear design, right? Nuclear design, nuclear reactor design. And so he goes and pulls some really authentic, old, good stuff off the internet related to archived, designs from historical sites. And I sat down with him and I said, you do realize, Dylan, that the NSA is probably watching us, right? Because of the things that you're searching on the internet. I'm sure you're on some kind of watch list. And I said, so don't be surprised if one day, the FBI raids us and says, why are you, interviews you and says, why are you looking at these things? These kids don't realize, sometimes that they think it's just it's their repetitive point of interest. And so I'm not aware that might be a problem.
To the exclusion of all of those, these are very smart, rational human beings, but once they get fixated on that, it's to the exclusion of all the other things around that they might, think about like that, right?
Absolutely.
And the other thing, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing this idea of rule following on there, which is I hear this a lot in child porn cases. Like, well, what is it really illegal? Because if it was, why would I be able to get it so easily on the internet? So, Dylan, what's the problem? It's here. I'm downloading these plans for these nuclear power plant. What's the issue? There's no,
Yeah. And so sort of dogmatically, right, and in a rigid way, people on the spectrum are kind of thinking of rules as going through an input-output table, right? So, well, does this really fit within the confines of what I know to be a social norm? And well, it really isn't, can't be something that's going to get me into trouble because again, like you mentioned, how would it be accessible if it were something that weren't allowable?
I'll give you one other quick example, which is, first of all, this autism and online offenses is more prevalent than you ever want. It's horrifying. I mean, I've handled a ton of these cases now, but one is chatting online with someone who says they're a 15-year-old girl. Well, guess what? My client learned the rules. And he learned it in the context of stranger danger, which we like to tell our kids about the internet. And what do we tell our kids is the main rule on the internet? It's whoever you're chatting with, nobody is who they say they are online. And it was told to him in the context of it could be a 60-year-old man that's trying to, exploit you, right? But the rule he learned is, doesn't bother me if she says she's 15. Nobody's who they say they are online. So go ahead.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think, and then if we kind of reflect back to Jamie's case, now you're talking about a young adult male who also, is a person on the autism spectrum who didn't know that he is trying to explore these sort of social constructs like sexual attraction, sexual identity, sexual issues, and using the internet to try to navigate that and to try to form relationships and so that becomes a really difficult thing for these individuals as well, is that until we're really making sure that we're providing that training, that's something that they definitely are going to struggle with and sometimes find themselves in a not so good place.
Yeah. And the idea of being online, the irony of it is they're exploring these social interactions in a way that feels more safe to them because human face-to-face contact is really hard.
Right.
But the irony is it's the Wild West. It's like a cesspool and there's a million ways to stumble into a horrible mess. So, okay. So here's what neurotypical people who have no experience with autism are going to say. Dr. Sparks, that's all well and good, but there's not a human being on this planet who can look at an image of a child being exploited sexually and not instinctively know that that is horrible and to run screaming from it. What would you say to them?
Let me hit it from this perspective.
Yeah.
Well, a really important aspect of understanding a person on the spectrum is understanding that the major disconnect that they're going to have is related to something that we refer to as theory of the mind. So in other words, they can be sitting in front of something that can be unpleasant, abusive. You could see someone else harming another person. But from their perspective, because they're not engaging in it, they can somewhat separate themselves from it. And so it becomes difficult for those people to sort of put themselves in the position of feeling what it would be like to be that individual who is sort of, experiencing that harm. So they're somewhat separated. And we think a lot of this comes from an area in the brain referred to as the mirror neuron, that they have difficulty with mimicry, but that they also have difficulty kind of making that emotional or social connection to, okay, I'm not really thinking about the other person on the other side of this. So you're going to see in individuals on the spectrum that lack of reciprocity, right? Give and take, but it's also going to be a lack of understanding and empathy for what's going on for the other individuals. So that's something we actually have to really work systematically to help to train and expose individuals on the spectrum to develop a sense of that. And it can be taught. and it can be learned, and then it's something that, you know, they can utilize to navigate the world.
Yeah.
But it's really something that someone has to be in full charge of assisting them with.
Oh, I'm so glad you raised the idea of empathy, but I'm more glad that you emphasize the fact that it can be taught, because I think that's a horrible misconception that our children don't understand, that they're not empathetic people, which then leads us into the world of, oh, are they psychopathic? Are they sociopathic?
Well, and sorry, Doug, to interrupt you, and quite the contrary, there's sensitivities, as Toni does a much better job explaining, that Dylan has that makes him so kind that you're afraid on the opposite end of that. And Toni can explain that more, but yeah, I think it's a horrible, I love when people say to me, oh, so do you still feel that your nephew, even though he's on the spectrum, that, you know, can you still tell that he loves you, or is he affectionate? And I'm thinking, wow, you know, people have an absolute wrong impression of that.
Yeah. And they absolutely can be taught all the time. You know, the simplest example I like to use is, you know, mine is the older one, Nate, and his little brother, who's 4 years younger than him, and he's very interested in having big brother, interested in him, you know, like that little brother wants big brother. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Because, you know, you're sisters. But, you know, Dylan will come run to Nate with something that he's so excited about sharing with him, and Nate will look at him and go, Dylan, I really don't care. And from an outside perspective, you're like, oh my God, this is the meanest, most hurtful, spiteful child. What is the matter with this kid? Right. And the truth is, he really doesn't care. And he's just being honest. But he doesn't, it's the mind blindness. He doesn't register in that moment how saying those words are going to emotionally impact his little brother. So we have to explain it to him. And then once we do, he gets it and he's better about it.
Yeah. And so really, so that kind of comes within the, you know, the narrowness and the confines of, you know, when people on the spectrum are living within their own preferred interest space, right? The things that are interesting to me are the things that consume me, they drive me. That's what's going to kind of orient me through the day. And so unless you're kind of along with me for the ride, what you're interested in is not of concern to me right now. And so I don't really want to talk about what you're interested in. And so definitely that's something that they, you know, experience on a daily basis. And I think the other thing, you know, Doug, when you're kind of explaining that between your two kids, the other thing that I think can become a real issue for kiddos on the spectrum too, is this gullibility. And so we'll talk about that too, which is that when they're out there in the world, which I do think puts them at risk for being victimized, right, in some of these arenas too, is that they don't realize that they're being manipulated. They don't realize that someone is planning, someone is coaching, someone is grooming. I mean, those are the things that you worry about with these kids too, as they go through this, you know, very adult world. You know, I've been in situations with Dylan where we've been at, you know, a large group meeting, and I can see that there are other kids that are somewhat making fun of him, right? He's off talking about nuclear design or some engineering technique, and you just tell that you've got a little bit of snickering, you know, to the side, and then people pulling him off to try to engage him in an activity that really isn't meant to highlight his strengths, but it's really meant to, okay, well, let's see if we can embarrass him a little bit, right? And all the while, he doesn't know that this is what's going on. And as a parent, you're sitting in the back watching, going, oh my gosh, do you know what? You know what's happening right now, right? And so I think that that's a real concern for these kids as they're young adults and you have access to all of this material. They don't realize that they're being led sometimes down these rabbit holes.
Yeah, so vulnerable. Well, so Jamie, okay, so you have the leg up because you have someone in your life, you have people in your life, you know this stuff. I think back in horror when I was a baby lawyer at the public defenders in the late 90s, and I had a client, I don't remember what he was charged with, maybe like a minor assault, and I remember very vividly, though, he was telling me that he had this thing called Asperger's. And I had never heard of any such thing in 1996 or 7. And I think he was trying to help me understand why he got into this situation, but I didn't I didn't connect the dots. First of all, it sounds like a goofy thing, Asperger's. Second of all, I have no freaking idea why I should care that you have Asperger's, and of course they're not able to communicate. So, Jamie, like, what is your best advice for a lawyer? Like I said, 1 in 44, right? How many cases have we defended over the last 25 years? Because has it been 1,000 cases that I've had? So I have missed tens and 20, 30, 40, I missed the issue, and we all do it every day. What is the advice you're going to give to a lawyer to look out for this and see and spot it? Because not everybody knows, not everybody has a diagnosis, and your guy didn't. I want to talk about that too, because that's another hurdle. But just from the outset, what are we looking out for? And maybe this is Toni too.
Yeah, so I think what we could probably all be better at, which is part of the reason that you and I connected, is I think we both have figured out that you can actually get a lot of wisdom and a lot of answers from your client in ways that, as attorneys and practitioners, we're so focused on the law and what legal argument can I make and what is our defense. And even when we're taught all about mitigation, we still use mitigation in the confines of, well, does it fit into parameter A through Z? And, we still think in this does it fit within the law? And I think we forget to sit with our client, look in his eyes, and try to find answers there. And I think they oftentimes will have answers that, if you're paying attention, can get you further than a lot of these legal arguments we spent all this time, studying. So I do think, I wonder, I guess if I'm being honest, if attorneys are hardwired in some sense not to have that, whether they had it and they lose it a bit.
Yeah.
I think we need to reconnect with it. Because I think our client tells us things. Here's an example. Someone had heard about this case and they called me, an attorney, and he was lovely. He's a very good attorney. And he said, I felt so bad. It was after I think they had gone through a trial. And I think he ended up contacting Toni. They had gone through a trial, and he said, and this was him doing a good job. He's doing what I'm proposing. We pay more attention to, but it didn't hit him till later. He said, there were things that he did that were odd. He said it was years in prison. He seemed totally uninterested in the trial, but he was obsessed with, I need to make sure I get to work on time. I mean, I don't understand. We need to keep this moving. He would become almost neurotic, obsessive. I don't, this is going to delay my work. And the attorney, rightfully so, is like, you're going to go to prison for a decade plus, and you care about whether or not you're going to make it to work. In hindsight, it dawned on him that was not a normal reaction, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think he did the right thing, even if it hit him a little bit late. We as attorneys need to take our attorney hat off and become human again. I know it sounds like really stupid advice in that sense, but I think if I could say to everyone, just for 5 seconds, try to have a conversation like a normal person, and not how will this fit into the law and what motion I'm going to file. Yeah. Because if I had done that with this young man, whether I'd had Dylan as this extraordinary experience or not, I would have missed it. I would have missed it completely.
Well, and that's one of the reasons Toni Sparks is one of my favorite lawyers, because she understands that this is fundamentally a human endeavor. And I don't think lawyers are hardwired not to be human. I think we're just taught wrong. I do. And we have to unlearn all that. Now, there's an old saying, if you've met one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum, which is to say it's a spectrum. Everybody's different. It manifests itself differently. But can we give some general guidelines to say, rigid rule following, I'm going to be late for work. Like, what are some of the things that might make you go, things that make you go,
So yes, I think that rigidity for sure. I think what you will notice is that when they are not in their comfort zone, you will start to watch people unravel a little bit. So you will see the anxiety. If you're paying attention, you'll see how, if you're not following a certain schedule, if you go off track, and I'm not doing a very good job explaining this, which is why I always have my sister around, but
we'll get to her.
The reason I say it is, That's when you say we are in the business of humans. And I think what I would say is, if you're noticing something that doesn't seem to make sense, as far as, okay, this doesn't seem to fit into a mental health box that we're trained, whether it's, okay, this person isn't bipolar, this person doesn't seem to appear schizophrenic, this person doesn't seem to have a drug addiction. If you're kind of going through things and yet you notice oddities in the way that you react, receptive is another very interesting way I think you can tell, where they will talk, but you're like, hey, were you listening? Like, are we in this conversation together? Were you listening to what I just said? Is this just kind of, they seem sometimes they do a little bit of a professor situation where they won't respond directly to my questions, which is some of what he would do. He appeared much older than he was. It was in fact noted in the doctor's psychosexual examination. And again, I'm not saying that, as you say, that's why it's so hard when you say it's a spectrum, you can't, define it. But I think it's our job, if we notice something in those areas, I think it's our job to research it, to look it up, to ask if there's been a diagnosis, to ask family history questions. And again, the problem is, as you said, a lot of it that goes undiagnosed, people won't identify it. But what I think you'll always find is you'll find a little kernel of something, whether it's anxiety or obsessive compulsive. You'll find something usually, I think, I would say, in a family history. I don't know if you would agree, Toni.
So what I want to do is kind of give Doug, you and your audience, a little bit of insight as to why Jamie's so good at what she does.
She is good at what she does.
Because her career post her prosecutorial work really has been in defending people who had some pretty dynamic backgrounds. They've, been accused and done some pretty terrible things. But I think she always felt like everybody's had a story, that needed to be told. And part of that comes from the fact that, as little kids, I was a really sick, chronically ill kid. I didn't go to school full time until I was in 7th grade. And my little sister there was the one who would travel from hospital to hospital, watching over me and advocating. And so I always say to people, if you think her advocacy career started when she went to law school, that's not at all when it started. It started when she was like 4 or 5 years old. Imagine this little kid, you have nurses about to walk into my room to, put the next injection in my IV. And, this little girl standing up going, what are you going to put into my sissy's IV? And that was largely led again by our mother, so she's in education, and a lot of that sort of awareness, I think, came from working with kids who had some challenges, had communication difficulties. And so we were kind of raised that way. So I think Jamie has a really amazing heightened awareness for that. But if we kind of segue that to, what you're looking for when we talk about people on the spectrum, when we speak about autism spectrum, it is a spectrum in the sense that you have people who will sit on the classically ASD end, and those who will sit on the high functioning end, where you hear Asperger's kind of, get tossed around. But what's interesting is that those two people on the opposite ends of the spectrum, one of which who may be nonverbal, may need augmentative communication devices to be able to, functionally communicate with the people in their world, get their, have their needs met on a daily basis. Those individuals share the same 3 characteristics. And that's what I think is really hard for people to understand, which is, how can someone who is so high functioning, so intact, so bright, so brilliant, share the same issues? And so what we're talking about when we kind of drill down to those 3 is it's in the area of communication, area of social skills, and then the other piece is that restricted, repetitive, thread of thought, right? And so what you're kind of looking for when you're looking, at these individuals is, a lot of what Jamie's described is, you're going to see that sort of insistence and sameness on topics. So you might have clients who want to talk about certain things all the time, or they have a particular interest, or they're very successful, but they love science, math, engineering topics. They're world history experts. They have incredible memories. They have a memory that you kind of just become befuddled by, that it's, there's such a huge inventory. People will describe them as little professors. So they like to lecture, but they're not connecting with anything else in the world. So that's where Jamie would say, I'm having this conversation, but I can tell that they're not there because I can tell that they're off thinking about whatever else is in their world. And then you'll notice things like, you may notice your clients tend to dress in a uniform. So that's some of the things that we'll notice about people on the spectrum, especially those who are on the high functioning end. They tend to have, they're very eccentric. And I think that's the other thing you're going to notice is they're eccentric. They're a little different, but they have a certain uniform they like to wear, so it's like certain pants, certain shoes, avoid other types of clothing. So you may notice that in your clients, which is that why did they come in here every day and they're always wearing tan slacks and a white shirt? Yeah. And that's all I ever see them in.
And that may be due to rigidity, this idea of uniformity, but it's also could be sensory. Are we getting there too? Because our guys have a lot of sensory issues going on too, don't they?
Yeah. So individuals on the spectrum, also people with attention deficit disorder, and keep in mind, a lot of people on the spectrum are also comorbidly diagnosed with ADD. All deal with sensory processing disorder issues. So coming into a new environment, sounds, lighting, taste, clothing, something that's tactile, those are all things that they're bombarded with that we're not used to as neurotypical individuals. So we go throughout our day and we're not bothered by, those types of stimuli that we come into contact with, where a person on the spectrum is being overloaded by that on a daily basis. So you may see that people coming in and out of your office and they're paying attention to lights flickering, they're paying attention to the noises. If you have a fish tank in the office and there's a filter bubbling related to the fish tank, you're going to notice that they really focus on those types of things. So really noticing what they're paying attention to, in the office can be kind of a trigger.
I had someone do an evaluation and she, and it was in her office and someone was microwaving food in the kitchen off, and this person, that's what he was focused on, the smell coming from the food being microwaved in the kitchen. What about eye contact? Is that a thing?
So no? I think it's a little bit of a misnomer because
really? Interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a component piece, but I think some of the more highly successful adults have learned ways to cope, which is they focus on something behind you. So it looks like you're maintaining eye contact, or they do it long enough to sort of look neurotypical, but they've really learned how to navigate that in the world.
Well, and that brings up a huge challenge, which is, and first of all, I hate the term high functioning, because first of all, I don't see low functioning autistic people on my caseload, which is the ones that are nonverbal or the ones that, I see the ones who, what we call are high functioning, which means they're intelligent, they can communicate fine, but they have all these hidden deficits. And they learn, like the person who can learn to make eye contact by looking beyond you, they're constantly learning how to fit in the world, so they're always masking the deficit. So of course we're going to miss it, right?
Yeah.
And so, in the human, the interest thing, I got to go back to that because this is about humanity at its core. Most lawyers are never going to ask the simple question of a client, what are you into? Like, we're going to sit down and like, okay, this is what the police report says. We got to deal with everything. And I put autism aside, any client, any case I ever had, it's like, what makes your heart sing? Like, what are you into? And then you're going to get a client who goes, wrestling. I love watching wrestling. And like, well, tell me about that. Who's your favorite wrestler? And then you're going to realize that they know every single wrestler in the history of wrestling back to 1943. And you're going to realize they know every single wrestling move and and every single channel and everything of this and Japanese wrestling and this and that. And you're going to go, okay, here we go. Now I get it. But I just asked you one question about who you are as a human being, and it opened up this universe to me, right? So I hope that's a takeaway in this, right? Okay.
No, and I think with that young man that we're talking about, I think I asked him. I just had this vision of Toni when Dylan was growing up, vacuums. So vacuums, I know more about vacuums than I ever thought I would, and I remember calling her one day and saying, how's your day going? And she's like, just great. Dylan's on the toilet and he's with the vacuum, he's holding it. And do you remember, Toni? And you're like, and you know, and between that, he had every time you go to the hardware store, they'll trade, right? Whether it was cars, vacuums, world history, but there was always kind of something that there was a hyper focus, whereas you and Toni have said you could date the history back to how vacuums begin. And every time we went into a house, it was, is there central air vac in here? And you always knew that you were going to go on an expedition. So I think I was asking that young man, I said, hey, you just asked the question, like you said, Doug. I was like, tell me a little bit about what you liked when you were little, I think is what I asked, just to see. And I think the stigma, here's what else was great. Growing up in this family, which we were all very free and open to talk anyways, I didn't see it. I think some attorneys would feel as though they were saying something that was offensive. And the first meeting looked at him and I said, have you ever been tested to see? I mean, I asked the question and I didn't find it offensive. And I think the sweet, loving, and amazing part about that is it's what you say, Doug. I think it's when you get offended when they say, I think I was trying to pick up on, why is Doug offended by high functioning? I was thinking to myself, I mean, you kind of explained it, but because I know you, I'm thinking, why is that so offensive to you?
Yeah.
And I think there must be something like it offends you personally.
It's not that it's offensive per se, but it's that it's such a misleading terminology in our business, because so many times a prosecutor, look, he's smart. He graduated high school. He maybe graduated college. He's functioning in the world. He has a job. He's very high functioning. So I'm real sorry that he has autism, but there's no way in hell he didn't understand exactly what he was doing and why it was wrong. And now it's time to drop the hammer on him. And I think, yeah, they don't understand. I mean, the person could actually be barely functioning in terms of the, the emotion, social, emotional things in life. But so that's why I hate it. I mean, I love that my son can function in the world. Don't get me wrong. I just feel like that's it's a dangerous label sometimes. Only in this situation. Right. In the world, it's fine. And this is, of course, a worst nightmare. But so, that's a good segue into, well, I always say when it comes to autism, neurotypical people are autistic. In other words, they have mind blindness because it's so hard to see the world through a person's eyes on the spectrum and understand why this matters. So now you've got this case, you've figured out that your client's on the autism spectrum, and we'll talk about the fact that he didn't have a diagnosis yet because that's a whole other can of worms, but you figured it out. Now, what do you do with that?
So I think the most important part was actually, it's the education of people, right? It's if they don't know what it is, what you were saying triggered for me this idea that sometimes Toni will give me the words to empower me on trying. And this is why I've also loved the work you do, which is the video. You tell a story and you make people see something in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. I always say to Toni, how do I explain to this person how it is a person on the spectrum, how their brain sees the world differently and why it's important? And so what I started with is the psychosexual examination for attorneys. I think it's really important. I was determined to find someone who at least had some experience with people on the spectrum. So this doctor I found had actually had a class of probationers that were on the spectrum. And I was listening to her talk. And I'm telling you, without this, if I hadn't known that it was important to have somebody who's evaluating this young man know about what this disorder is, otherwise he could come across very much all the things we've just talked about. Your son, I'm really not interested in that, right? All of these things that can be assumed to be one thing in a psychosexual examination, that could have blown up in our face. But I really do, this isn't helpful to the overall problem, but I have to say it as a part of this case. The prosecutor is like the epitome of what you want angel of justice to be. And so she was open-minded, which sounds like I'm not giving her a huge compliment, and I mean to, but if you can just have an individual who will listen to you to say, I'm going to send you video. I'm going to send you educational articles. And this is what I was going to say to practitioners. We start like this, right? We just start. I try not to, I know you try not to, but sometimes you get there. When you just send an article, they might think you're crazy. They might think it's a little different. They might think you've got to be kidding me, but it starts the conversation.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but for those of us who may just be listening, what she was doing was making this fighting motion that we start in an adversarial process where we're kind of at odds with the other side, which is kind of how the system is designed. But the truth is, a lot of prosecutors are very human beings. They're very human people, and they're very receptive. And they may even have people in their own life that they can relate to this. So it's important to start off with okay, we're going to be partners here until, you may reach a time when you realize they're not your partner anymore. And then you start this punching thing, not literally for anyone that's listening, but just sorry, you know what I'm saying. Go ahead. Sorry. But
just sending an article, sending a video, sending those things. We did those things in this case. I had a good pusher over there of information in my sister, but if you there's finally at least some movement in articles and good work, you know, a few people do, Doug, that you can call and reach out to.
Toni, by the way, sent me 2 really great articles I'm going to put in the show notes so people can have those. But go ahead.
Toni, were those some of the ones that we sent?
Yeah. So I think, what you guys are talking about too is somewhat the model that's been used in education. So it was really nice to watch it unfold with Jamie, which is that in education, we can also become really siloed, right? Where you just kind of fall into your normal natural role, which is like, as you're talking here from a legal perspective, we're just going to be adversaries and, and fight tooth and nail over this. And so it was really nice to watch what we've tried to model in education, right, is this notion of wraparound service, which is that we're not, working independently of one another. We have to communicate, we have to talk to get the best result. And that's the only time when we have really good outcomes for kids. And I think you saw that between Jamie and the prosecutor. It really was incredible to see the way that they were having reasonable, rational conversations and kind of having special considerations given the diagnosis. I don't think you see that a lot in the legal forum. And so some of the articles that we're talking about here today, it was a UPitt law review article that said we've got to start to recognize that in the criminal justice system, you're having people come through who are on the spectrum, and we have to make different considerations because of the way that they're interacting with the system. So, have somebody who comes in who's on the spectrum, who's sitting in front of a jury, and they look like they're detached and they don't care what's going on. And the jury's watching that and going, well, they've got to be guilty because they don't have any remorse. They look like they couldn't care less that they're here. And so, helping attorneys to identify that, but then also helping the criminal justice system to kind of, soften or offer some sort of explanation or support. And so that article talks a lot about the use of therapeutic jurisprudence, that you have to be making a little bit different considerations. So that comes later in the process as Jamie's working through with the attorneys. And then we get to a point where we're talking about possible mitigation and deferring jail sentences.
So, and I think just as a human sort of race, we're on the front end of understanding autism. So it's not surprising that that's going to translate into the justice system, that they don't get it, but some people are further along than others. You had an additional hurdle in the case though, Jamie, right? Which is, how old was your client?
19. The reason I'm pausing is he was 18, I guess, when he had done this, but he was 19, of course, when, So, but the additional issue was he'd never been diagnosed with autism, right? Yeah. And, I think that is another thing that needs to be changed, as far as, I don't think, everyone looks at that and says, oh my gosh, well, isn't that horrible? And you're exactly right. The reason you say it's a hurdle is because anybody says, oh, sure, you get arrested, and all of a sudden, you want to say that he's on the spectrum. I think they call it the
excuse du jour. Some of the less compassionate, understanding prosecutors. Oh,
which is
okay, I got it. And isn't that
awful.
convenient that you're just saying that now when he's never had a diagnosis his entire life?
Like it's the new sexy thing, like it's ADD, and we're saying somehow it's an excuse for something
Right.
that's committed. But no. So the reason I think that needs to change too is I think that inherent in everything we're talking about you would easily understand why many people would not get diagnosed. I mean, everything that we're talking about actually just lends itself to saying you can see how this would happen. And here's what's really mind blowing, and I think it actually helped us. This young man's with a nice family. He's with an educated mom who's in the school system, who took him to professionals, and professionals missed it along the way. And so I think in some sense we had the benefit of saying they did try, but I feel like you can always point to behavior that's quite crystal clear, even if you get the diagnosis later. And I think you almost have to use it to empower the argument instead of looking at it as a deficit, which I get it. Trust me. You know, they look at you like, sure, everyone's going to have autism now. But if you start looking at the numbers, you can say to them, actually, you'd be surprised if you do a number crunch. Yeah, a lot of our clients probably do.
It may be also that you mentioned this earlier, Toni, that there are often other diagnoses that go along with it. So there's this constellation of other things happening, whether it's ADD or ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. So it could just be that, maybe they got diagnosed as ADHD and that they missed the autism. What I found is that if you don't actually know autism as a professional, that you are going to miss it, And I'll give you the worst example, actually. By the way, these cases, it's not just about child pornography and that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of ways our kids can get and run afoul of the law. And in this particular case, it was a internet threats case. And my client was kind of mad at these kids because he thought they were kind of grandstand. It was actually the kids, some of the Parkland, the survivors, and they have very high profile on social media, and he thought they were kind of grandstanding, so he started trolling them, and he was saying some really horrible things, and they took them as violent threats. And mind blindness, my client goes, well, I was trying to annoy them because I'm annoyed by them, but I certainly wasn't trying to threaten. I didn't think they would receive it emotionally as a threat. But they got so my client's special interest that he liked to be fixated on, unfortunately, happened to be serial killers. Now, as bad as that sounds, I mean, go to Netflix. There's 1,000 shows on serial killers. We're all interested in those, but he's hyper-focused on serial killers. So they got a world-renowned expert who knew fuck all about autism to opine on the stand in his trial that he's probably just a serial killer in the making. And it was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. But the truth is, if you don't know about autism, you don't know what you don't know, and you're going to get. And so it's not surprising to me that the diagnoses are missed with professionals, well-meaning professionals throughout their young life, and B, sorry, but parents aren't always super excited about having that label attached to their child, so they themselves may be resistant to the autism diagnosis, right?
Right. So can I tell you about how for 6 months my kids were obsessed by those novels that, described stories of very famous people and how they died. And those were the titles of the books, right? How did this person croak? It was basically, I mean, you have to think of it a little bit as what a lot of people on the spectrum do is they inventory, right? So once they get interested in something, they consume a topic. They have to go through the entire inventory of it relentlessly until they've consumed it, mastered it to memory, and then they can move on to the next. So what's hard, I think, for neurotypical people to do is some of those more taboo topics or things that we might not go down and pursue. There's some kernel of it that draws that area, that sort of just focused area of interest. And they're not going to leave it until I've gone through and I've taken my slides of this particular aspect or this particular topic. It won't happen. I mean, they really do have to chronicle everything until I can pull myself away. That's hard for other people to understand. And it's what makes them so successful. because they can be in these careers. They can be astrophysicists. They can work on they can work for Raytheon. They can be incredibly brilliant engineers, because none of us could focus like that and get those types of projects done down to the detail that they do. And that's what's so confusing to people, is how can you be as brilliant as you are, and yet you can't go to a party and have a social conversation without causing some kind of stir, or having somebody say, "What's wrong with you? Why would you say that to me?" So how can you be so, adept and yet so inept in those easy, what we consider to be the easier portions of life?
Yeah.
Those are the things that are hard for them.
It makes me think of the book. Have you read Neurotribes, the book Neurotribes? And he talked about Hans Asperger, who came up in Nazi Germany.
Right.
And he studied this, and of course that's where Asperger's come. But he called his kids his little professors. But when the Germans came knocking to say, "Well, we're in the business of exterminating all these deficient, decrepit, disabled people along with everybody else," he said, "No, these are the people that are going to design, your most brilliant aircraft and architecture and everything else, and convince them that this isn't a deficit. There are so many strengths there," which to me fills me with hope. I love that. I also have to share a personal story. I don't think I'm on the autism spectrum, but who knows? I'm 52. We didn't have that.
Can I weigh in on that?
Yeah, no, you can't. But I'm thinking about high school. So this is going to make me sound like I'm 1,000 years old, but we listen to the radio a lot, right? And like at night, that's all I had is a little alarm clock radio. So I would listen to like programs on the radio. Dr. Ruth, that's how I learned about sex. And Dr. Demento was my favorite, But I listened to this program it was about Satanism, and how they would put backwards messages in music. And they were talking about Hotel California, and this is about Satan and Anton. And so I was I thought that was so fucking cool. Plus, I was into heavy metal. So I started checking out books from the library on Satanism, the Satanic Bible, and it led me to like the Manson thing. So I had, at one point in time in high school, I had Helter Skelter and a book on Satanism in my locker. And I look back on that and I thought, well, if any like school official today searched a kid's locker and found those books, there'd be big trouble. And the simple fact is, I'm interested.
We could also use that as one of those examples of what to look for, remember?
Right.
I don't know, my little radar is kind of going off.
Now you're going.
I was like, Toni, can I get some opinion on that, Toni?
Well, and you know what? One of the folks that I kind of like to talk about is Tim Rice is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and he's written in the areas of music, and he tells this really funny story about, he's 45 years old and he's taking his son into the pediatrician to talk about, I think maybe we need to look into a diagnosis, because he was much more affected, right? There were a lot of more obvious, signs and symptomology that the spectrumness was there. And he said, I just remember the pediatrician turning to me and saying, "Tim, well, you didn't know that your son was on the spectrum? I mean, you are clearly." And he turned to the pediatrician and said, "What in the hell are you talking about?" And he said, "I just sat there in the office." And he said, it was like in that moment, it washed over me. And I thought, oh my God, my entire life makes sense now.
Yeah.
Like why I did the things that I did, why I had difficulty in college, why I had, and he said, and I also, and he shows these photos. He said, why I look back at my old school photos. He said, and I always have the weirdest look on my face when I'm going to take an individual photo of myself. It's like I'm not quite sure how to represent myself. So he shows a series of about 22 pictures of himself. And he's always with these odd smiles, these odd gestures, this odd sort of modulation of his face. And he said, now all those school pictures make sense to me.
Yeah, my son is going to graduate this year, and I think this year is the first year he had a school picture. We're like, oh, that's a nice smile, Nate. It took him 17 years to learn. But in story world, this is really interesting because they call that the rush of insight, which makes a perfect story. And the best example is The Empire Strikes Back, when Darth Vader finally says, "Luke, I'm your father," and you didn't. as a viewer, you didn't see that coming. None of us did. But we automatically went through every single major story point in the first and second episodes, and it all made sense. And it all became clear. And when we concoct the stories, if we do it right, those things are perfectly placed to make perfect sense of what happens. But in real life, and this goes back to the fact, Jamie, you didn't have the diagnosis, but you have these things of history in your client's life that you can't make up, you can't change. They're probably documented in a lot of the records if you do the work to get them, to where you can overcome. Well, first let me ask you, was it a hurdle? And if so, how did you overcome it? And if not, how would you overcome it if it was? That's what we call a compound question in the lawyer world.
Doug.
Was it well, let's start out. Was it an issue for you?
Not really, in the sense of, again, that's where you wonder how much of this was a little bit of this perfect storm of individuals that came together. Without this prosecutor, I think it would have been a hurdle. And maybe it would, maybe in some sense it was, but because she took the time to listen to the explanation. So I don't know if it was a hurdle. I think you answered the question. There's always something, and that's where you can't be afraid of hard work either, right? You got to dig in, you got to call people, you got to get social histories. I mean, that's where you kind of say, hey, we get comfortable doing certain things, but you can't be afraid to say, let me talk to Aunt Betty, let me talk to this person, because sometimes if you don't have the documentation from schools, you can find it from people, and you have to do the work. There's no way getting around that. But I would make up for it through documentation in school, through anecdotal storytelling, which is social history. I mean, that's a very real thing in objective tests as well. So I think you overcome it that way. And I actually think, again, back to the education, you can find things. We'll talk about why these things go undiagnosed. So this isn't a big surprise necessarily on a lot of it. And as you said, it masked itself in other ways, or they were troubled in different ways, or relationship forming, or you'll find it somewhere if you educate yourself and look enough into the record, into people's histories. Something that was really interesting when you guys were talking, Toni and I can barely even talk about it because of how horrifying it was. But this young prosecutor was equally as compassionate. The only, I think, peaceful thing or beauty of this occurring was that the young man's father, I think through process of this and getting evaluated, was evaluated as well. And I think his whole life made sense to him. And the tragedy is, when this all happened, I think he didn't know, his father, that is, didn't know how to absorb it. And he basically died of a heart attack after our client was arrested shortly thereafter. And
wow, I didn't know that.
And he actually died. He didn't die in that moment, but our client was with his father in the moment, and called 911. And
wow.
having to talk to him about that. And obviously there's all sorts of things that went in for our client and his heart and soul and how he felt about it. But the one thing our client will say, and Toni would know more how to address that because she speaks with him more frequently, but he said, I think my father felt so relieved and really came to peace with knowing there's something about life when you have an explanation for things. There's a lot of peace and beauty in that. But yeah, what a story.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a really incredibly difficult time. And that was really soon after. That was a pretty immediate consequence. And I do remember having a sort of Zoom conversation with mom and dad, and having dad say to me, so, sort of now that we know, should I go and get diagnosed? And I said, well, I don't really see the reason for you to go get formal diagnosis. I said, I think you kind of know. And he just chuckled, and I said, so the work we're going to do with your son, hopefully that will help you, and will bring some realization to kind of maybe why you were who you were, you know, throughout your life. And like Jamie said, I do think that that brought him both some realization, but also I think an explanation as to why, you know, what had happened with his son had happened. And I know that that's provided Jamie's client, you know, some peace too, and understanding how did I end up here, and why did I end up with all this obsessive thinking, you know, that type of thing. And so, wow. But that was a really but we definitely talked about that a lot during the mitigation phase, which is that if you don't think this young man had been punished, he'd been punished. He's going to carry that guilt with him for the rest of his life, I would think. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is another great segue. Well, we're getting close to the end, but I got a couple more things, and of course, we want to hear the result too. Which, but the idea of punishment, because this is set for sentencing. So ostensibly, this is a podcast about sentencing, but of course, all the work you do that goes into the hard work of developing your case and developing the mitigation, and that all dictates what the ultimate result is going to be. But a lot of folks who are facing prison for these very, very serious offenses, lawyers don't fully understand why autism matters for the severity of the sentence that they will face if they are made to be in an incarcerated situation. Can you speak to that a little bit, about what life is going to be like for a person on the spectrum in custody?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it was a major tenet of trying to explain a punishment and the idea of punishment. The idea, and this is not a stretch, it's going to sound like a stretch, and it really truly isn't. When we talk about Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, I sincerely mean this, that it is a form of punishment that you cannot compare to the regular person who is not on the spectrum or who doesn't have the disorder. There's this article, again, it was basically describing if you threw somebody, I think it was Toni, you throw them, it's like in the worst part of the ocean, the deepest part of the ocean, and just let them drown, that's how it would feel to a person who was on the spectrum to go into these types of facilities. You can also bring up a lot of detail about their risk for being harmed, their risk for being manipulated, their risk for, I mean, God, I don't even want it to know. I think you did, Doug, a video that I unfortunately sent to my sister, and she cried for a few days and told me that she never wanted to meet you. This was prior to all of this, because she said it was so emotionally upsetting to her that she's like, I don't know how he does this. But
I have a new one to send you, by the way, but go ahead.
She does not want it. She does not want it. She was upset she was like, I can't watch. I think she literally wrote, why did you send this to me right now? I can't handle it. But I know that dealt with the idea of what would happen to this person when they're incarcerated. And I actually am so glad you brought it up, because I think as defense attorneys, it's actually one of the most powerful points, because the idea of punishment is not the same. And when we're talking about equitable remedies, when we're talking about equitable sentences and to be treated fairly, you cannot compare a 20-day jail sentence to somebody who's on the spectrum to somebody who is not, for all of the reasons that make it unique. Sensory, I mean, it hits almost every single thing you could think about, and why it would be that much more traumatizing. So it was absolutely a part of the sentencing. Toni, you remembered that portion, Toni, when we talked about that with?
Yeah, so I think those were probably 3 of the hardest days of my life recently, because Jamie came to me and said, so we have an opportunity to write, one more time to the committee about, deferring this jail term. And so I think, Doug, as I'm sure you do, I think when you're in those moments, I'm always thinking about my own kids. And I'm thinking about how can I advocate as strongly as I would want someone to do for my own children. And so because Jamie's so good at this, she hit all the major points, but I think at the end of the day, I think how we started out, kind of trying to persuade the committee, is that to say we're not trying to abdicate responsibility here. Like, that is not the point. The point is to say that when we're considering, outcomes for this individual, that medically speaking, you take someone who's on the spectrum, who's receiving psychotropic treatment. We all know that when you go to prison, those psychotropic treatments are likely to end, or you're going to be given alternative treatment that isn't, what it is that somebody's been used to utilizing. For someone on the spectrum, that can be a come apart moment, right? If you're not being treated that way. This individual is also receiving a lot of intensive behavioral support. So that behavioral support goes away. So there's no communication, no coaching. None of that is available. Then Jamie talked about the sensory processing piece. So take someone, put them in prison where they can't control, we can't modulate any of those things. That's like, and the comment that Jamie was making is, it was Simon Baron-Cohen, who's one of the leading researchers right in this area, who said, taking a person on the spectrum and putting them in prison is like taking someone who is wheelchair bound, throwing them into the deep end of a pool and expecting them to cope. And because autism can be an invisible disability to those of us who are neurotypical, we don't understand how someone being locked up in a jail cell, that literally is going to can be life altering. And then the social pieces. So imagine you can't read other prisoners. You can't read social cues. You can't pay attention to any of that. Let's say you misperceive something that another person's trying to communicate to you.
Yeah.
You can end up really, really, harmed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the things that, we talked about. And just the fact that this is a person who's, even after a year, if you're even considering giving a year, after a year, this person will be completely, in a position where they're just completely decompensating. That's very hard to, so I think making the case for how successful and making progress he was, and to please not remove him from that path, because we have a chance right now to put him in continue this purposeful path that he's making, where he's showing that he's doing the work. He's doing the work, he's committed.
Yeah. And this idea, I think, of rule following is so central to the outcome, because what the decision makers need to understand is, A, they didn't know they broke the rules. B, that these folks, I don't want to stereotype, but I'm sorry, they're inherently rule followers. That's how they order their lives. That's how they function in the world, by getting structure and rules. And C, once they understand the rules, they're never going to break them again. And by the way, they're horrified that they did run afoul of it once they do understand, because they are capable of learning empathy. So if you actually talk to like Mark Mahoney or people that track these cases, there's basically a zero recidivism rate of the cases that we know of folks on the spectrum who got involved in things like child pornography, right? Because they didn't know the rules, but they do now. And by the way, back to the prison situation, there are two sets of rules in prison. They're the institutional rules, and they're the inmate rules. So which ones are you going to follow? Because either way, you're going to be in big trouble if you pick one over the other. So I can't even imagine. It's the worst nightmare. One last piece of this, though, because disability rights and advocacy is that's your area of expertise, and so what I didn't understand before I heard the name Toni Sparks is that there are actually things that we can do to help advocate. God forbid our clients are in custody, either awaiting disposition, sentencing, trial, or they get sentenced for something. There are things that lawyers can do to help advocate for their rights. They actually have rights, because this is a real disability. Can you give us a little nutshell about that?
So this is another sort of really point of interest, because Jamie and I have been working on another case together that has similar overtones. And I think the one thing that's been sort of eye-opening for me is how unforgiving, right, these systems are, and that you would think a person who has a disability is going to have more receptive, more real-time response to, I need these things, how do I get a hold of them? And then seeing how that doesn't happen, whatsoever. I mean, nowhere near in the prison system. But I think, the important point here is that what a lot of people don't realize is that most of the time when you're someone who ends up incarcerated, I think most people just assume all your rights end there, and most of them do, right? But there are two laws that still follow you into an incarcerated or prison situation. And so Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II in particular, still protects individuals within the prison system to make sure that reasonable accommodations are made to help to support them as they're within that system and navigating it. And then we also have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which still demands that we provide access to individuals who have a mental or a physical impairment. And as long as you're an institution that's taking federal dollars, you have to maintain, fidelity with 504. So ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, and Section 504 are still things that attorneys, families need to be aware of, that they can use to advocate for services for individuals in the prison that are reasonable. Accommodation, support, supplementary aids, that's something that does offer protection.
Good. Thank goodness for the small things.
Right.
All right. So we could probably keep going, but I would like, they tell us lawyers, primacy and recency. Oh, no. Start with a bang, end with a bang. And so we haven't talked about, what the two of your advocacy has gotten, what kind of result ends up for a client who's facing 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in prison for having child pornography. What happened in the case?
Yes, so I should say the judge, Judge Whitehead, we should definitely be thankful to him as well. He took the time, had the compassion, I think, and educated himself, read sentencing memos, basically, reviewed all of the same things that the prosecutor had. And
well, wait a minute. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I feel bad, but part of part of my rants, I get fired up about stuff sometimes. And one of the things that fires me up so much is that the prosecutor holds so much power to fashion a plea. So before we even get to the judge, they have the power to say, screw you guys. You're going to plead to a mandatory minimum. Your guy's going to do at least 10 years. So I have to believe that your advocacy had an impact on at first the plea before you ever get into court at sentencing, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we got to a point where the plea was 1 year in jail. And here's the thing that you can appreciate, Doug, and my sister can appreciate it from going through the process. That was a complete gift. Mm-hmm. It was a gift sent from above. We often said that his father must have something to do with it, and we were so thankful. But the problem was we would not be intellectually honest if we did not just have this entire podcast and not understand that 1 year would have probably destroyed him.
Yeah.
So here I was in this horrific position, and I thought, okay, I understand that she's giving me a gift.
Yeah. And by the way, people don't understand why that's such a gift because they don't know Maricopa County and the plea process and the policy book and the rigidity of that institution, and the fact that if you get child porn, almost every single time you're going away for a very, very long time, and they're very hard to move off of their policies, and so that is a huge gift in that particular system. It may not seem that way in some other realm, but in Maricopa County, holy shit, it's massive.
It is. And so I think that's, again, when you talk about that crossroads where you're a practitioner, but you're human, and you think, and again, I can't say it enough that prosecutor and in the people that she staffed it with deserve a lot of the credit.
Yeah.
But we were, what is it? When you're afraid to take one more run at it because you're thinking, oh my goodness, I don't I don't know that I'm going to push my luck here. And I want to tell these people I'm appreciative, but let them know that I still don't know if it's being relayed properly, what this will do to this young man. And I think that what we just had, that whole discussion on jail and prison and what that does to the individual, I think that they took, to their credit, another look at it. And my sister had been working with him and still does work with him. There are all sorts of behavioral interventions, if that's the right way to say it. There's all sorts of things that can be done. And all of that was being done to his credit. His whole life had changed. So this horrific process had come in and actually made this young man's life a much better world to live in. And I think they actually took a hard look at that and said, do we want to send this kid in there and potentially have these, really, he would have been victimized in there. It would have been brutal what would have happened to him. And so thank, whether you believe in God, whether you believe in the universe, whether you believe in Judge Whitehead, or the efforts of all of these people that took a moment to have some humanity and to look at something in a different light, even though we had already kind of pushed our luck. I could not be more thankful. And that young man went before Judge Whitehead, and he looked at us and he did not give him a day in jail. And he said he was glad of the work he had done and that he wanted him to continue to do it. And it's just been, it was really one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had professionally. And to be able to do that with the help of my sister was like something I didn't think I could ever experience. So from that little girl who was watching my sister, be so sick, and then watch her come in and advocate for someone, I couldn't have done it without her. And it was just this wonderful kind of full circle moment.
I love that. That is a hopeful story. You guys are lucky to have each other. And you save someone's life, which is, unfortunately, we don't get to have the beautiful happy endings all the time. So when we come, we have to relish them with all of our heart and soul. Okay, so thank you so much for both of you for sharing your beauty, your knowledge, your expertise, your humanity. This was a good hour. So I want to tell people where they might be able to find you too if they need you. And I hope nobody ever needs you in that way. But if you do, first of all, don't go to sparkslaw.com, because you're going to get an elderly gentleman from Texas who looks like a very wonderful lawyer, but not quite in your sense. So go to jamiesparkslaw.com, or you can just sit underneath the billboard and did you see that Simpsons?
Rid of the billboard.
Did you see that Simpsons episode where Homer was worried that Bart was going to be gay, so he sat him underneath the billboard for hours and hours of the beautiful woman smoking the cigarette? And he goes, "How do you feel, boy?" And he goes, "Pretty good, but I could really use a cigarette." And Homer goes, "What kind?" And he goes, "Anything slim." Don't!
I knew we couldn't end this without you mentioning The Simpsons. I mean, it's just like, you can't help yourself.
And if you need an amazing, incredible expert, Google Toni Sparks. It'll bring you to her page on University of Arizona with an email there. But of course, I'm going to put their information in the show links too. So no, I'm not crying. I just have like allergies or something. It's something in my eyes. Damn you two. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
I appreciate what you guys do. That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, Hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.